Coming up on Network Africa, 4 killed as Togo's opposition defies government ban on weekday protests. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta snubs vote crisis meeting organized by the chairman of the election board. And Johannesburg's Mayor Herman Mashaba vows to enforce the deportation of undocumented foreigners in South Africa. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Wongoka. We begin in Togo, where at least 4 people have been killed in ongoing protests, with clashes between protesters and security forces in the country's 2 largest cities, Lomé and Sakode. The opposition supporters defied a government ban on weekday protests by planning a second day of protests today. This follows months of demonstrations on and off against the regime. Since mid-August, thousands of people have demonstrated throughout the country demanding the return of the 1992 constitution, which includes a limit of 2 presidential terms. Well, Mr. Ejeta Otonio, a legal practitioner and public affairs analyst, joins us on the program. Glad to have you on Network Africa.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Togo opposition supporters, they're back on the streets, day 2, defying government's ban on protests. Can these actions bring the much desired change that they hope?
Well, Togo, as well as another country in the West African sub-region, Cameroon, have remained the relics of the very unpleasant past politically in West Africa and indeed in Africa. Now, if you look at the political evolution of Togo, you will notice that protests have become a recurring decimal over time concerning the sit-tightism that has become the lot of Togolese. And now this is not very pleasant to talk about, because what has happened in Togo in the last 50 years has been a case of a family taking over the leadership of that country and ensuring that there had not been any transitory power in terms of democracy in Togo. So naturally, the Togolese people have felt encouraged by the recent happenings in the Gambia, which saw the ousting of Yahya Jammeh, for them also to want to take up their destiny in their hands and see whether it is possible, after 2 generations, whether it is possible for them to also experience constitutional democracy. And that is exactly what is playing out in Togo. And I'm sure it's going to have to happen until something gives.
Yes, interesting you mentioned Togo is not the only one in what some would call sit-tight syndrome. But then, is the Constitution helpless in avoiding these sorts of situations?
Unfortunately, the Constitution is a document that opens with the words, "We the people give to ourselves this Constitution." And then this Constitution is also a document that is regulated by the representatives of the people in Parliament. So if, for example, the so-called representatives of the people in Parliament have their allegiance to the president, that Constitution will not work. And the Constitution is just a document. For example, in countries and other climes that do not have written Constitution, over time they have had conventions, customs that regulate their constitutional democracy. So in this particular case, the Constitution is also helpless, because those in power, and I'm sure they have the majority, have their allegiance to the current president. And that makes it impossible for the Constitution to work, because that's the same reason why the father, Nasingbe Yadema, had to change the issue of the 2 terms limit before he got re-elected in 2003, eventually died in 2005. So the constitution is neither here nor there. That's why the people are on the streets to say this will not work.
Now, how do they get out of this deteriorating human rights situation in Togo?
It's unfortunate. There will be repressions, there will be killings, and of course, for 6 days, the authorities in Togo shut down the internet service. And most of these things are to help cow the will of the people. But I think it's important that they do not let down, because if they do, then they're going to see this fellow recontest for a 4th term in year 2020. That will take him to take his position in power for another 5 years. And I don't know for a lifetime how long the Togolese people are going to have to put up with the dynasty of Yadema. I don't know.
What role do you think ECOWAS, AU, and perhaps international bodies can do?
Well, of course. You see, the ECOWAS sub-regional body is also limited to ensure that they do not interfere in the internal affairs of a country, except where there is an election, clearly, and the opposition wins, and then the current or the incumbent president refuses to give power. Then ECOWAS, under its treaty, could come in and say, look, you have to leave. That's the only condition on which ECOWAS and, of course, AU and wherever can come in to interfere. But as it is right now, what is playing out in Togo, the international community is watching. And, of course, they'll have to call out the president if they find out that he's mowing down people on the streets because of legitimate protests.
Your final thoughts. Do you think democracy is for the African continent?
Well, it's unfortunate, but there has to be some form of government. I have not really looked at democracy as an ideal when it comes to our system of government in Africa. But I insist that the people should be able to determine who rules them at any particular time. So authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and all of that cannot have a place in the modern world. Africa inclusive cannot have a place.
All right, we'd like to thank you so much, Mr. Ejeta Tonio, legal practitioner and public affairs analyst, for joining us on the program.
Thank you. It's good to have you.